All right, so this is a recap for week 7, and so this mind-body problem issue, as I said in the lectures, is something which has persisted for a long time in the discourse in philosophy of mind. You might even say that the specific discipline of philosophy of mind is built up around this mind-body problem initially. Um, so to restate this mind-body problem, or at least as we have been presented it, we have Descartes, who gives us this framework, which, I mean, he didn't invent the framework. It's a fairly common way of thinking about the interaction between the body and something else, this other part of us that might exist. Which is called dualism, right? The idea that there is, on the one hand, a physical body, and on the other hand, a non-physical mind, soul, spirit, something like that. And these two things together are what kind of explain, at least in humans, movement and thought and speech and all that, right? So the body is somehow inhabited by or actuated by this other thing, the mind, the spirit, the soul, whatever. So that's the kind of picture that we're getting from Descartes. He, as it were, formalizes this picture by saying, okay, well, look, the body is material. Material things are characterized by a number of characteristics, specifically and most importantly, extension in space, right? So that means that physical things have shape, volume, and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, non-physical things, so he's referring to them as mental things, these have a different set of characteristics which do not overlap, which make them entirely different from physical things. And chief among those is sort of a negation of one of the qualities of physical objects, and that is mental objects are not extended in space. Mental objects don't, or mental things don't have shape, volume. They don't exist, in a sense, at a particular place, right? So being extended in space, I mean, it's a little bit tricky. So just saying being extended, that right there doesn't technically mean that something is not located in space. So sometimes in mathematics you get this idea of points which are non-extended, which are sort of somehow zero-dimensional objects which still exist at a place. It's almost like they are a place. But we're not really getting into that kind of thing here, and Descartes' not getting into that thing, even though he was a mathematician. He was an engineer. He was very much into geometry. So I don't think I mentioned this before, but when you talk about the Cartesian coordinate system, you know, with the 4 quadrants when you're graphing equations, that is, you know, sort of invented by, or at least popularized by, made useful by René Descartes, right? So he is a very mathematical thinker, but he is not talking about mental objects as being like zero-dimensional points in space. He is talking about them as being entirely different from physical objects. And when he's characterizing physical objects from mental objects, when you look at more extended discussions of his argument, he essentially gives a negative characterization of mental objects. That is, he tells you what physical objects are, the properties they have, and then he defines mental objects by saying they don't have these properties, right? Physical objects are destructible, mental objects are non-destructible. Physical objects are extended in space, mental objects are non-extended in space, right? So we have a purely negative definition of the mental. When we talk about a negative definition in philosophy, we don't mean to say that something is bad. We mean to say that something is defined only by what it is not, what it does not have, rather than what it is and what it does have. So the definition that we get of the mental is sort of sparse. But that's kind of what we get from Descartes. It is a particular formalization, a particular way of cashing out this more commonly held idea that there are two types of things, one physical and one spiritual or whatever. So he wants to take this idea and put it into, philosophy and put it into science, because he's part of the Enlightenment where everything is supposed to be explained in this kind of mechanistic scientific picture, and he's trying to put this dualistic idea into that picture. So he puts forward this idea that the mind, that mental substance and physical substance are totally different from each other, but yet they still influence each other. At least the mental substance influences the physical substance, right? The soul, the mind animates the body. So then this poses a problem, as we saw, according to people like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, because if indeed mental objects, mental substances do not exist in space, are not spatially extended, they don't have spatial location, then there seems to be no way that they could actually interact with physical substances. They couldn't interact with physical substances. There's no good sense in which they could inhabit physical substances because they don't really take up space. They're not located. So when we say that something is my mind, what does that mean? It can't mean that it's physically co-located with my body because mental substances aren't located. It's not like that it's here or anything like that. It becomes sort of difficult to even talk about what it means to possess a distinct mind or what even makes minds or souls distinct. These sort of ideas are followed up on by or enlarged upon by other thinkers, or they are sort of dealt with by other thinkers around the same time as Descartes. So some people, when faced with the mind-body, with dualism, try to explain the interaction problem by saying, well, actually they don't interact. What happens instead is that they are somehow synchronized, right? So it's not that the mind and the body interact, it's that when you're hungry and when you have a desire for food, those two things are sort of synchronized. It's not that one causes the other, there's no influence, they just happen at the same time. So this sort of view is put forward. It's generally dismissed by most philosophers because it doesn't explain why they're synchronized, or the explanation is just sort of, oh well, God does it, right? You could also respond to it by saying, oh, there simply is no mind, and this proves it. Or at least the mind is this thing which sort of doesn't do anything, right? So there's a lot of ways to respond to it. But what Princess Elizabeth is doing is mostly trying to say, she's not trying to say that there is no mind. She's trying to say that the definition has to be wrong. There has to be some other way to define what mental substance is in order that we can get the interaction. So Descartes has a more elaborate theory than what we see in the chapters. Descartes talks about the mind influencing the body somehow through the pineal gland, which is in the brain somewhere. And the pineal gland features in a lot of kind of pseudoscientific explanations of mental phenomenon. And his idea was sort of that there were these, as it were, animal spirits, this kind of energy or something, which were actuated by the mind, by the pineal gland, and then made us do all this sort of stuff, caused emotions and thoughts and whatnot. But of course, this idea is a problem if mental substances, can't interact. So Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia there's more to Descartes' argument, which makes it even more pressing that he be able to explain how a mental object can act on a particular place in space, in the body, right? Because he says that the pineal gland is where this interaction occurs. So he very much needs this to be possible. And so that's why Princess Elizabeth's objection is so forceful. So what I saw some people saying in the discussion and whatnot was, for instance, that, well, obviously the two must interact because something has to be controlling our behavior. Much more contemporary philosophy of mind. So, for instance, I teach, this term I'm teaching an upper level course in what's called Extended, Embodied, and Embedded Cognition. So this is a contemporary series of views, theories in cognitive science, which are all purely physicalist theories and which attempt to explain cognition and mental function with sort of very complicated computational frameworks. You talk a lot about connectionist networks and how large amounts of complexity and self-organization and self-structuring of data can lead to things controlling themselves, right? So you don't need some central control unit, you don't need some external locus of control to explain why the body moves around and does stuff, according to these sorts of theories. So it's not necessarily, it's not obvious that simply because we move around, we do things, we have thoughts, that there must be this separate individual thing distinct from our body that controls our body, right? So that's not an obvious conclusion. And so when you say, well, something must be controlling us, therefore, you know, the mind must interact with the body, you're on a little bit of shaky ground there. And that's sort of one way that you can go in response to the mind-body problem, is sort of say, oh, well, we don't need a mind. We don't need this separate thing to do what we're to explain the phenomenon we're looking at. So I saw some people say things like, well, obviously the mind must be extended and located, and isn't that just what the brain is? And you're sort of there prefiguring the answers that you get in more contemporary philosophy of mind, which say that the mind and the brain are the same thing, but those tend to be the physicalist answers that we've looked at in this week that's just ending today. They say, yes, the mind does exist, but it's identical to the brain. There is not a separate type of substance. The mind is just something like a particular organization of brain matter, right? The mind is just what happens when you put brain matter into control of a body or something like that. There's a view that we don't really get much of a chance to look at that's kind of suggested by what we do in week 8, which is called functionalism. And it still is, I guess, kind of one of the more popular views in philosophy of mind. And it says that the mind is something like software compared to the brain, which is something like hardware, right? So when you talk about installing a program on a computer, you don't have to think about the software as being this distinct thing, right? That kind of magically inhabits the hardware. The software is just a particular set of activation configurations on hardware. It's a certain kind of way of stimulating the hardware, way of activating the hardware to do particular things, right? When computers do computations, we don't have to say, oh, there must be this like mathematical spirit which inhabits this. No, it's perfectly explainable in physical terms. And that's the way that philosophy of mind has tended to go in the late 20th and now early 21st century. So, you know, if you're kind of at a loss, you're saying, well, obviously the mind does something, then you can either sort of, there's a lot of ways you can go. And hopefully this philosophy course has sort of indicated that there's always more than sort of two solutions to a problem. The solutions may be very bizarre. So for instance, this synchronizing idea that I mentioned earlier, that's the solution to the mind-body interaction problem, but it's a pretty bizarre solution, right? It sort of requires a lot to go unexplained, or it requires sort of an explanation in the form of constant intervention by some outside force. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's false. It just means that it's very implausible and it would be very difficult to prove. And all other things being equal, a more simple explanation would be favored. So if we can explain some sort of interaction idea without invoking the constant intervention of some outside force to keep things synchronized, then that's better. If we don't even have to invoke a second type of substance at all, which is what the physicalist is going for, even better, right? We try and avoid having these sort of external requirements on our theories, these sort of beliefs that don't necessarily have to do anything with what's being talked about, but somehow yet influence it. And that's what the idea of bringing God in to explain things is. It's kind of superfluous, or at least it's not where you should start. You should start trying with just using the physical stuff that we have in front of us, and if that fails, then you start trying more exotic solutions. That's the way that philosophy of mind tends to proceed now. Just to reiterate, the mind-body problem, as we've looked at it, is an interaction problem. It's a question of how two substances which are sort of entirely unalike, and especially two substances, one of which exists and is located and extended in space, the other one which does not exist, is not located in space. How could these things interact to get the sort of mental causation which we take for granted in our explanations of people's behavior, right? We say that someone's belief made them do something. Belief is a mental object, and then actions like walking to the store, physical, right? How can we bridge the gap between these two types of thing so that we can get a sort of coherent explanation of them? That's what the mind-body problem is asking. That's what Elizabeth of Bohemia says that Descartes does not give us, an explanation for how these things mesh. And that's, moving into week 8, what we're trying to get an explanation of. And of course, I will post a recap of week 8, hopefully a bit earlier than I have been for all these other ones. Today I'm going to go through and try and catch up on the backlog of recaps. And I started with the most recent one because it's more relevant to what we're talking about right now. And also I figured this particular topic would be more interesting than some of the other recaps that I've missed for you. So this is the week 7 recap. You can look forward to the rest of the recaps being recorded and published today as well. I'm missing a week 5 and a week 6 one that I need to catch up on.